Stop right there. Boy, you fit the description." The words came from Officer Derek Harlan with a cold finality, followed by the sudden crack of metal against bone as he seized Jamal Thompson and drove him hard against the patrol car, the pressure crushing into Jamal's injured shoulder and forcing a sharp cry from his throat. His tie twisted. His folder of paperwork fell to the pavement, and the sting of humiliation settled into his chest as the cuffs bit into his wrists. In that instant, the truth cut through the moment like a blade. What happened on that quiet street, under the weight of a false suspicion and a manufactured threat, would not disappear. It would rise, it would spread, and it would end the careers of the men who believed they could bury it. Before going into this story, take a moment and tell me where you are watching from. Your support means a great deal. Please subscribe to the channel, and give me a like if stories about justice and accountability matter to you. Now, let us begin. Jamal Thompson stepped out that morning with a calm sense of purpose, carrying a thick grant proposal he had spent weeks preparing. It represented an opportunity to expand the youth mentoring program he had built from nothing, a program that kept children away from violence and showed them they had worth. He had kissed his daughter Aliyah goodbye with a gentle promise that he would return before dinner. He wore a neatly pressed shirt, a modest tie, and the quiet confidence of a man who had lived his life with integrity. Yet, as he walked toward his car, he became the target of a malicious call placed by Karen Whitaker, a neighbor who had watched him for years and never once greeted him by name. She saw only what her prejudice allowed her to see, in her mind. A black man walking with a folder on a quiet suburban morning could only mean danger. Her voice trembled with self-righteous certainty as she called the police and reported a suspicious man looking into houses, a statement crafted from fear rather than truth. Officers Derek Harlan and Mike Stanton arrived moments later, their patrol car rolling to a halt with unnecessary urgency. They had been primed by a flawed facial recognition alert that misidentified Jamal as a burglary suspect from a neighboring county, instead of verifying facts. They stepped out with weapons drawn, feeding off each other's aggression. Jamal raised his hands at once, his voice steady and respectful. He offered his name, explained where he lived, and gestured calmly toward his own home just a few yards away. But Harlan's expression hardened with hostility. He barked contradictory orders, stepped closer, and seized Jamal with a force that suggested he had come looking for a confrontation. The pressure of the slam tore through Jamal's shoulder, sending a deep ache radiating toward his spine. The humiliation rang louder than the pain. To be treated as a threat in front of his own home, moments after kissing his daughter goodbye, cut into him with sharp and bitter clarity. Across the street, Evelyn Harper, a retired journalist with a keen instinct for truth, heard the commotion and recognized the tone of a confrontation that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with control. Her doorbell camera was already recording, but she stepped to her window with her phone to capture what her instincts told her would soon be denied. The scene before her was not the first she had seen in her life, but it was the first she had witnessed on her quiet block, where neighbors waved at each other and pretended the world's ugliness stopped at the subdivision's entrance. She watched as Jamal tried to speak, only to be silenced by Harlan's grip. She watched as the cuffs tightened. She watched as Karen Whitaker stood at her doorway with her arms crossed, nodding with quiet satisfaction, and she watched as Jamal, dignified even in distress, tried to keep breathing steadily so he would not collapse in panic. Mike Stanton hovered nearby, his hand resting on his holstered weapon as though a man in handcuffs could somehow become dangerous by sheer existence. He glanced at Harlan with unease he refused to express. He knew the arrest was wrong. He knew the match from the facial recognition system had been flagged as unreliable, but silence felt easier than courage. He stood by and let the scene unfold without challenge. In that choice, he sealed his own fate. though he did not yet understand that the consequences were already in motion. As Jamal was pushed into the back seat of the patrol car, his eyes drifted toward his home. He imagined Aliyah finishing her breakfast at the kitchen table. He imagined her looking out the window when she realized he had not returned to grab the lunch he left on the counter. He imagined her confusion, her fear, and the questions he did not yet know how to answer. The door shut with a heavy thud, and the cruiser pulled away, carrying him toward a station where lies would soon be written into official reports. Behind them, Evelyn Harper remained at her window, clutching her phone with trembling hands. She whispered to herself that the recording must be saved, that the truth must survive the version officers would later write. She understood that every frame mattered. She also understood that the men who had just taken Jamal away believed no one would challenge them. She stood alone in her living room and felt a quiet fire rise within her. She would not let this moment vanish. At the station, the narrative began to change before Jamal even stepped inside. Harlan rehearsed his false account with Stanton, shaping a story that framed Jamal as hostile and aggressive. He wrote quickly, eager to establish dominance before anyone else could intervene. Jamal asked for medical attention. No one responded. He asked for a supervisor. His voice was ignored. Hours passed with silence pressing against him from every direction. He felt his shoulder throbbing, but the deeper pain came from knowing how swiftly a simple walk had been twisted into a criminal accusation. He tried to remain steady, tried to breathe evenly, tried to cling to the truth that he had done nothing wrong. It was then, in the cold stillness of the holding area, that a distant memory surfaced, years earlier. He had been honored at a community leadership event in Washington, District of Columbia, where he met Nathan Hale, a White House liaison who admired Jamal's dedication to youth programs. Hale had given him a business card with a quiet promise. If you ever face something bigger than you can handle alone, call me. At the time, Jamal had smiled politely, not imagining a day when he might need such help. Now, seated in a room clouded by injustice, he reached for that memory like a lifeline. What had begun with a prejudiced call and a violent arrest was already gaining momentum beyond the officers' control. The consequences they believed they could avoid were already gathering strength. The truth had been recorded, preserved, and soon would be delivered to the highest levels of power. The men who acted with impunity would learn, step by step, that this was the moment that ended their careers. Jamal sat in the small interview room with his injured shoulder throbbing beneath the fabric of his shirt, the cold metal chair pressing into his back as officers Derek Harlan and Mike Stanton crafted a version of events that bore no resemblance to the truth. Their voices carried through the thin walls, calm and practiced. As they rehearsed each fabricated detail, they wrote that Jamal had refused to comply, that he had stepped toward them in a threatening manner, that force had been necessary to protect themselves. They documented resistance that never happened, aggression that never existed, and danger that only lived in their imagination. Jamal listened to their low voices and felt a mix of disbelief and sorrow, aware that their words would become a weapon aimed directly at him. He asked for a supervisor, but none came. He asked for medical attention, but the request was brushed aside. Every moment stretched into the next with heavy silence. Yet he held on to the hope that the truth, captured on Evelyn Harper's devices, would not stay buried. An hour later, Evelyn arrived at the station, determined and steady, clutching her phone and a folder of printed screenshots with timestamps. She announced calmly to the front desk that she had footage the department needed to review. The receptionist hesitated, overwhelmed by the certainty in Evelyn's voice, and called a sergeant. Within minutes, officers were whispering among themselves. The footage circulated from phone to phone in quiet shock. Some watched with widening eyes. Others felt a cold pressure settle in their stomachs. The truth contradicted every line in Harlan's report. Jamal had complied from the beginning. He had raised his hands immediately. He had never resisted. The footage showed excessive force, not defiance. It showed an unprovoked assault, not a threat. And it showed the department's new facial recognition technology failing in a very public and undeniable way. A few officers exchanged uneasy glances, knowing this incident would not disappear into routine paperwork. A feeling of dread spread through the station, quiet but unmistakable. When Jamal was finally allowed his one phone call, he held the receiver with trembling fingers, the weight of the moment settling on him. He reached into his memory for the name that had resurfaced earlier. Nathan Hale, the White House liaison he had met years ago at a community service awards event. Jamal dialed the number printed on the back of the card he had kept tucked away all this time. Nathan answered within seconds, greeting him warmly at first, then falling into silence as Jamal described what had happened. Every detail, every lie, every injury. Nathan listened with growing concern, asking pointed questions that revealed he understood the gravity of the situation when Jamal finished speaking. Nathan's tone shifted from compassion to resolve. "I'm moving this forward now," he said. "You'll hear from someone in a few minutes. Stay calm. Help is coming. 10 minutes later." A call came through the station's administrative line for Jamal Thompson. It was transferred to an office phone, where Jamal was permitted to take it under supervision. On the other end of the line was Monica Reyes, an agent with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Her voice carried a steady authority, the kind that cut through confusion like a clean blade. She asked Jamal to recount everything from the initial encounter to the moment he picked up her call. He spoke slowly, carefully, emphasizing truth, not emotion. Monica recorded his statement, asked follow-up questions, and assured him that the information he provided would be handled immediately. She paused before ending the call, then spoke with quiet conviction. "This is now a federal matter. You are not alone in this." Word spread through the station faster than any official announcement could contain it. Officers whispered in hallways, phones buzzed with alerts. A rumor took hold. The feds are asking questions, and no one knew how far the inquiry would go. Some officers stepped away from their desks, suddenly nervous about their own reports, their own patterns, their own conduct. Others kept their heads down, pretending not to hear the rising tension. But Harlan heard every murmur, and each one tightened the knot in his chest. He tried to maintain his usual swagger, but the unease settled on him with a weight he could not shake. He demanded to speak to the chief. Chief Harlan Vance, Derek's cousin, entered the building with an air of forced confidence. He summoned Harlan and Stanton into his office, shutting the door behind them. He surveyed their reports, listened to their prepared explanations, and dismissed the seriousness of the matter with familiar arrogance. "This will blow over," he said, waving a hand as though brushing dust from a shelf. He resisted. "You followed protocol. I'll handle the rest." But his composure cracked when an officer entered the office and whispered that a Department of Justice agent had already made contact. His eyes flickered with unease before he forced his face back into its hardened expression. He instructed the men to say nothing, admit nothing, and stick to their story. His tone carried an undertone of desperation, disguised as authority. He did not know how much evidence existed or how many witnesses had already stepped forward. Meanwhile, Jamal sat behind the glass partition in the holding area, feeling a new surge of quiet strength rise within him. A few hours earlier, he had felt powerless. Now he felt supported by forces he had not expected to call upon. He knew the recording existed. He knew Evelyn had brought it forward, and he knew the Department of Justice was listening. His shoulder ached. His cuffs left marks on his wrists. but the truth, preserved in video and carried across phone lines, had already escaped the confines of the station as Jamal waited. Evelyn sat in the station lobby, refusing to leave until she confirmed he was safe. She watched officers walk back and forth with anxious tension in their steps. She studied the atmosphere shifting with each passing minute. She felt it in her bones. Something had begun that could not be reversed. She texted Alicia Rivera, a local reporter she trusted, urging her to reach the station with a camera crew. Alicia responded immediately. Already on her way, Nathan Hale, miles away in Washington, attended to the growing situation with urgency. He alerted his superiors, briefed the Civil Rights Division, and ensured that Jamal's name reached the right desks within the right departments. The call Jamal had made, one call, the one he had never expected to use, had already cut through layers of bureaucracy. It had already forced accountability into motion inside the station. The tension thickened as officers moved with restless uncertainty. Chief Vance barked orders, trying to silence the rumors, but the truth had slipped beyond his control. His attempt to manage the situation from within the department no longer mattered. Those who watched the footage knew what it showed. Those who heard whispers of federal involvement understood what it meant. And those who had participated in burying past complaints against Harlan felt the walls closing in. The chapter of lies written that morning, the chapter Harlan believed would stand unchallenged, had already begun to crumble. The call Jamal placed had broken the silence the department depended on. The evidence Evelyn brought had dismantled the false narrative. The arrival of Department of Justice scrutiny had stripped away the protection Harlan and Stanton once relied on. And as Jamal waited, injured yet steady, he realized that the truth, now visible to far more than the officers in that room, had already begun its ascent toward justice. Nothing would remain hidden. Not this time. This was the moment when the facade of authority began to fracture, and the careers of those who believed they were untouchable started their slow, inevitable descent. Evelyn Harper's footage reached the evening news before the sun fully set. Carried by Alicia Rivera's calm but unmistakably urgent voice as she narrated every second of the recording. The video showed Jamal with his hands raised, speaking respectfully, offering nothing but cooperation, only to be slammed against the patrol car with a force that made even the viewers at home gasp. Within minutes, phones rang, social media feeds filled with outrage, and conversations began in living rooms across the city. Alicia stood outside the police station with a microphone in hand, her tone measured but pointed, making clear that a grave injustice had unfolded on a quiet suburban street. The story spread quickly, and with it came a collective sense of disbelief and anger that someone so deeply woven into the fabric of community service could be treated as a threat. Reverend Elijah Grant watched the broadcast from his office in the historic church that had long served as a safe haven during times of turmoil. He recognized that the moment called not only for compassion, but for leadership. Within an hour, he arranged an emergency gathering, sending messages to community members, urging them to come together with dignity and purpose, determined to stand beside Jamal and ensure the truth would not be silenced. Karen Whitaker, meanwhile, watched the news with rising panic as her name circulated online. Her call to the police had been included in the station's public log, and neighbors began confronting her online, demanding explanations she could not provide. She took to social media, writing defensive posts filled with excuses about suspicious behavior and neighborhood safety. But her words carried little weight against the undeniable clarity of the footage. Comments surged beneath her statements, challenging her reasoning and pointing to her long history of avoiding any interaction with Jamal. The backlash grew swiftly, leaving her isolated and anxious as her once secure sense of superiority unraveled. But instead of self-reflection, she clung to resentment, convinced she had done nothing wrong, even as videos from her own block proved otherwise, as the community tried to make sense of what had happened. Jamal faced a different kind of pressure. Anonymous messages began appearing on his phone, each one laced with threats or demands for silence. Some warned him to drop the matter. Others implied that pushing forward would bring harm to him or his daughter. He showed the messages to his attorney later. But in that moment, he simply sat on the edge of his bed, the weight of the day pressing heavily on him. He watched Aaliyah sleeping peacefully down the hall. Unaware of the mounting storm around them, he promised himself, quietly but firmly, that he would protect her, no matter the cost. Civil rights attorney Sofia Ramirez saw the footage during the broadcast and felt the familiar pull of duty and outrage tighten in her chest. She was known across Atlanta for taking difficult cases without hesitation, driven by a deep commitment to justice and an unyielding belief in the dignity of every individual. She reached out to Evelyn minutes after the segment aired, asking for additional copies of the recordings. By the time she called Jamal, her mind was already working through the strategic steps they would need to take. When Jamal spoke with her, his voice steady but tired, she assured him that she would take his case pro bono and that he would not face this fight alone. She explained that the footage was powerful evidence, capable of piercing through fabricated reports and institutional silence. Her tone carried a quiet certainty. She would stand with him, step by step, until the truth prevailed. While Sofia assembled preliminary documents and reviewed early statements, Lieutenant Maria Cortez moved carefully through the shadows of the department where she worked. She had long known of Harlan's pattern of behavior, having seen complaints submitted by victims whose voices had been ignored or buried, but she had never witnessed consequences follow. That night, she retrieved archived records with meticulous precision, pulling 6 prior reports that had never seen the light of day, each one describing excessive force and abusive conduct. She met Sofia in an unmarked parking deck, her face carrying the burden of a woman caught between her duty to the department and her duty to the truth. She handed over the documents without hesitation. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. These were never meant to disappear. Use them. She knew she was risking her career, but she also knew that silence made her complicit, and she refused to carry that weight any longer. The community meeting at Reverend Grant's church grew larger than anyone expected. Families, elders, young adults, and longtime residents gathered, filling the pews with a mixture of sorrow and determination. People shared stories of their own experiences, stories that had been pushed aside for years, yet the mood remained peaceful, orderly, guided by Reverend Grant's firm commitment to unity. He spoke with a voice that resonated through the sanctuary, reminding everyone that justice required patience, strength, and unwavering resolve. The meeting brought comfort to some, resolve to others, and a collective understanding that what happened to Jamal was part of a broader pattern they could no longer ignore. Back at home, Jamal returned late in the evening, exhausted but grateful for Evelyn's protection and Sofia's guidance. As he stepped through the doorway, Aaliyah rushed toward him, wrapping her arms around his waist. He held her tightly, careful not to strain his shoulder, feeling her small hands press against his back. Her voice trembled when she whispered that she had been scared. He reassured her softly, promising that everything would be all right. But even as he smiled for her sake, he felt the lingering sting of the day. He saw the note taped to the front door earlier, a sheet of paper with the words, "Drop it or pay the price," written in thick black ink. He had hidden it before she saw it. He would never let threats reach her. Sofia called him again before midnight to discuss the next steps. She laid out the strategy with clarity, emphasizing that transparency was their greatest weapon, She explained that the community was already mobilizing, that Evelyn's footage was beginning to circulate nationally, and that Alicia Rivera had requested an interview as soon as Jamal felt ready. He thanked her, his voice filled with quiet gratitude, understanding that her support represented more than legal guidance. She believed in him. She believed in the truth. As Jamal prepared for bed, he reflected on the day with a heavy heart. The pain in his shoulder pulsed with each movement, but it was the emotional strain that weighed most. Yet he felt something new emerging beneath the exhaustion, a steady sense of resolve. The system that tried to intimidate him had underestimated the power of truth, of community, of people who refused to look away. Evelyn had stepped forward with courage. Sophia had joined the fight with conviction. Reverend Grant had rallied their neighbors, and Maria Cortez had chosen integrity over silence. The lines were drawn, not in anger, but in purpose. The movement for justice had begun. And as Jamal closed his eyes, he understood that the threats, the lies, and the weight of discrimination would not break him. With the truth on his side and allies by his side, he was prepared for the battle ahead. District Attorney Victor Lang stood behind his polished desk with an expression of manufactured confidence as he reviewed the evidence brought forward by Sofia Ramirez. Yet he dismissed every piece of it with a stubborn resolve that revealed more about his priorities than his principles. Despite the clear footage showing Jamal's compliance, despite eyewitness accounts, despite the mounting pressure from community leaders and the growing national attention drawn by Alicia Rivera's reporting, Lang insisted on moving forward with resisting arrest charges. He framed it as a matter of maintaining order, speaking in rehearsed phrases that had been polished over years of political calculation. But beneath that practiced tone was an unmistakable undercurrent of fear. He felt the weight of a brewing scandal, yet he clung to the belief that he could outmaneuver the truth by doubling down. His decision marked a turning point, one that would ignite consequences he could no longer control as the hours unfolded. The following week, in the early afternoon, 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of Jamal's home with an unnecessary show of force. Officers knocked loudly at the door, their posture rigid and confrontational, repeating the script Lang had crafted for them. They carried a warrant for Jamal's rearrest on fabricated witness intimidation charges, claims entirely invented to discredit him and erode public sympathy, inside the house. Aaliyah was with a babysitter, helping with homework at the kitchen table, when the pounding on the door echoed through the hallway. She froze, her eyes widening with the memory of what she had learned about her father's recent ordeal. The babysitter tried to reassure her, but the moment felt heavy with dread. When Jamal opened the door and saw the officers standing there, he felt the familiar sting of injustice wash over him once more. He raised his hands calmly, refusing to argue in front of his daughter, but his heart cracked a little as he heard her voice tremble behind him, pleading for answers he could not yet provide. As he stepped out onto the porch, the officers surrounded him with a display of intimidation meant to send a message. His neighbors, alerted by the commotion, emerged from their homes. Some filmed the scene, unable to believe the repetition of what had already made headlines. The babysitter held Aaliyah back, keeping her close, but the little girl's tears flowed freely as she watched her father placed in cuffs again. The cuffs pressed against the same wounds created days earlier, and Jamal's shoulder throbbed with renewed pain. Yet he kept his voice steady. He told Aaliyah he would be home soon. He told her to stay strong. His calmness only deepened her fear, because she understood how hard he fought to maintain it. When news of the second arrest reached Reverend Elijah Grant, he immediately called for peaceful protests outside the police station. Within hours, the crowd formed, filled with families, elders, and young people standing shoulder to shoulder with signs expressing unity, determination, and unwavering support for Jamal. Reverend Grant led them in prayer, urging the community to remain disciplined and peaceful, even in the face of provocation. Alicia Rivera set up her camera equipment among the crowd, delivering live updates with a steady voice that conveyed both empathy and unrelenting scrutiny. Her reporting highlighted the absurdity of the allegations, exposing the contradictions in the official statements and the convenient timing of the arrest. Viewers across Georgia watched, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding inside the station. Jamal sat once again behind the same glass partition, though this time his posture revealed something different. He no longer carried the quiet despair of a man overwhelmed by a system stacked against him. He carried the calm resolve of someone who knew he was not alone. He knew Sophia was already drafting motions. He knew Evelyn had stepped forward again with additional footage captured from her vantage point. And he knew the Department of Justice, now fully engaged, was watching every action taken by the department with a scrutiny that weighed heavily on the officers. His stillness became its own form of defiance. In another part of the building, Lieutenant Maria Cortez moved through the halls with deliberate caution. She had anticipated retaliation from within the department, and the second arrest confirmed her fears. She checked her email and found messages implying that her cooperation with outside counsel would be noticed, but instead of retreating, she pressed forward and continued leaking internal documents to Sophia. She shared records of communications between the chief and district attorney. She shared testimony from officers who had previously raised concerns about Harlan's conduct, but were silenced. She shared internal policies manipulated to hide misconduct. Every document, every detail, became a piece of the growing mosaic of corruption that stretched far wider than Jamal's case alone. And with each action, she felt the quiet liberation that comes from choosing integrity over comfort. Chief Harlan Vance, who once believed his influence could contain the scandal, found himself cornered by mounting public scrutiny. He attempted to address the press in a hastily arranged conference at the station entrance, his face drawn with tension, but before he could begin, Alicia Rivera stepped forward with her microphone, asking direct questions that forced him into a defensive stance. She cited timestamps. She cited contradictory statements in his department's releases. She asked why a man who complied peacefully was charged twice, and why the department refused to acknowledge the footage that contradicted their reports. Vance faltered with each question, his responses vague and strained, revealing cracks in the facade he had spent years polishing. His attempt to regain control only highlighted his loss of authority. Meanwhile, inside the crowded protest area, a quiet ripple of emotion moved through the gathered residents as they received word that the FBI's lead investigator, Agent Kira Sato, had officially opened a federal civil rights inquiry. The announcement felt like a breath of clean air cutting through weeks of suffocating tension. People exchanged hopeful glances, clapped softly, and held their signs higher. The news reached Jamal shortly after, brought to him by an officer who could not hide his discomfort. Jamal sat back, breathing slowly, letting the meaning of those words settle into his spirit. This was more than oversight. This was accountability rising at a federal level, and with that rise came the first tangible assurance that truth would shape the outcome, not the manipulations of those who had abused their power. As evening approached, the protests continued without disruption, illuminated by streetlights and the soft glow of candles held by elders and young children alike. Reverend Grant addressed the crowd from the front steps of the church, reminding them of their unity and the importance of peaceful resistance. He spoke of Jamal's years of service to the community, of the values he modeled for the youth he mentored, and of the courage required to stand against injustice. The crowd listened with reverence, their faces reflecting both sorrow and determination. Back inside the holding cell, Jamal sensed a shift in the air. He no longer felt isolated or overpowered. He felt supported by people who believed in the truth. He felt strengthened by the courage of those who stood outside, by the resolve of Sophia and Evelyn, by the integrity of Maria, and now by the involvement of federal investigators who had the authority to dismantle the web of corruption that entangled his case. The second arrest, meant to intimidate and silence him, had instead revealed the fragility of those who orchestrated it. It exposed their desperation. It exposed their fear. And as Jamal rested his head against the cold wall, he understood something with perfect clarity. The fight ahead would be long. But the tide had turned. The lies were unraveling. The truth was rising. And this moment, this unjust, unnecessary rearrest, would become the very act that sealed the fate of those who believed their power could stand against justice. Agent Kira Sato arrived at the police department with a quiet authority that instantly shifted the atmosphere. Her team moving with practiced precision as they began seizing body cameras, dispatch logs, and the department's internal servers. Officers watched with tense expressions as federal agents passed through hallways that had long shielded misconduct behind closed doors. The investigation unfolded methodically, each step peeling back layers of hidden truth. When the digital forensic specialists accessed the server, they uncovered attempts to delete portions of the body cam footage from the morning of Jamal's arrest. But the department had underestimated the resilience of modern archival systems. Automatic backups had preserved everything. Every deleted frame, every timestamp, every detail of the confrontation they claimed never happened. The agents examined dispatch logs and saw entries edited minutes after the initial report. They recovered text messages between Derek Harlan and Mike Stanton sent before they even arrived on scene, revealing a chilling exchange in which Harlan wrote that he planned to teach him a lesson and that the match was good enough for a stop. The words carried an unmistakable tone of hostility and intent. They were not responding to a threat. They were pursuing one they had invented. In the conference room temporarily repurposed for the investigation, Agent Sato sat across from officers called in for questioning. Her voice remained calm, steady, and unyielding. She asked direct questions about the facial recognition alert, about the decision to approach with weapons drawn, about discrepancies in their reports, and about prior complaints against Harlan that had been quietly dismissed. Some officers hesitated, glancing nervously at one another. Some attempted to shield their involvement through vague answers. Others, sensing the gravity of the federal inquiry, broke away from the culture of silence and spoke honestly about the warnings they had raised in the past. The truth emerged piece by piece, revealing a pattern of misconduct that had been ignored, suppressed, or justified by those in positions of authority. Chief Harlan Vance, feeling the pressure closing in around him, attempted to reassert control through a hastily arranged press conference. He stepped to the podium in front of the station, surrounded by department flags and flanked by officers who stood with forced rigidity. His statements were carefully crafted, insisting that the department had acted appropriately and that the investigation would vindicate their actions. He blamed a rush to judgment, criticized media coverage, and urged the public to trust the process. But Alicia Rivera stood among the reporters, holding her microphone with unwavering focus. When the opportunity came, she stepped forward and confronted him with questions that cut directly through the vague narrative he tried to present. She cited the timeline of the arrest. She cited the failure of the facial recognition system. She cited the contradictions between body cam footage and the written reports. The chief's responses faltered, his confidence cracking beneath the weight of her precision. Each question left him more visibly unsettled, his authority slipping away in real time as cameras captured every strained expression. Inside the department, the federal agents continued their work. They intercepted emails from administrators discussing damage control, containment, and narrative management. They uncovered a plea from a junior officer who had reported Harlan's abusive behavior months earlier and had been dismissed as overly sensitive. They found unsigned drafts of disciplinary reports that were never processed. They identified encrypted folders containing prior misconduct files that had been moved from accessible systems to hidden directories. With each discovery, the structure that had shielded Harlan for years began to crumble under the weight of its own corruption. While the investigation continued, the community outside united with growing strength. Protests persisted, peaceful but resolute, illuminated by candlelight and anchored by the unwavering leadership of Reverend Elijah Grant. Residents shared their stories with reporters. Parents spoke about their fears for their children. Young adults spoke of encounters they had never reported. Elders spoke of decades spent hoping for change. The narrative shifted from Jamal's case alone to the broader legacy of discrimination that lingered in the community. And through it all, Alicia Rivera broadcast each development with professionalism and moral clarity, refusing to let the truth be obscured by officials who attempted to minimize the significance of the investigation. Back in the holding area, Jamal sat with a steadiness that revealed the strength he carried within him. He listened as an officer quietly informed him that Agent Sato had formally placed Harlan and Stanton on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The officer's voice dropped even lower when he mentioned that Chief Vance had announced a sudden personal leave of absence. Jamal exhaled slowly, allowing the meaning of the moment to settle into his consciousness. He understood that the investigation had reached a decisive turning point. The fractures within the department were no longer invisible. They were visible, undeniable, and irreversible. Sofia Ramirez visited him shortly after, her expression carrying both determination and a rare glimmer of relief. She explained that the evidence the federal agents collected was far more extensive than she anticipated. She mentioned the recovered text messages. She mentioned the deleted footage. She mentioned the internal emails. Jamal listened with gratitude, recognizing that Sofia's relentless efforts, Evelyn's courage, and Maria Cortez's integrity had made this moment possible. Their actions had illuminated a path that corrupt officials could no longer distort. Agent Sato, having completed the initial phase of her review, addressed the press in a brief statement outside the courthouse. She confirmed only the facts she could publicly disclose, that the investigation revealed inconsistencies, that body cam data had been tampered with, that internal documents showed procedural misconduct, and that the officers involved were on leave pending further action. Her statement was measured, yet it carried the unmistakable weight of federal scrutiny. She ended with a promise that every aspect of the case would be examined with impartiality and precision. The news spread across the city with profound impact. Families gathered around televisions, neighbors exchanged conversations in driveways, community leaders organized additional meetings to discuss next steps. The sense of helplessness that had lingered after the initial arrest began to give way to something stronger. Hope combined with resolve. As night fell, the final pieces of the day came together. Administrative leave notices were issued. The district attorney's office received formal inquiries demanding documentation related to Jamal's case. The police department's oversight board scheduled an emergency session, and the community prepared for the long fight ahead, strengthened by the knowledge that federal eyes now watched every movement. Jamal, released pending the review of his charges, stepped outside the station and breathed deeply, the cool night air carrying both exhaustion and relief. He knew the journey was far from over, but he also knew that the truth was now anchored by institutions far beyond the reach of those who had wronged him. The investigation had opened the first visible cracks in the shield of power that once protected the officers responsible, and those cracks would grow, widening with each piece of evidence, each vocal witness, and each step forward. This was no longer simply his battle. It had become a defining moment for the entire community. one that revealed the strength of unity, the necessity of accountability, and the undeniable truth that justice, once awakened, refused to be silenced. The federal courthouse in Atlanta rose with solemn authority as Jamal Thompson entered with Sophia Ramirez at his side. The quiet hum of anticipation filling the long corridors where reporters, attorneys, and observers gathered for a hearing that had captured national attention. Inside the courtroom, Judge Elena Vargas presided with a calm, stately composure that commanded immediate respect. Her gaze swept across the packed room, taking in the attorneys, the officers seated stiffly at the defense table, the community members who had come to show support, and Jamal himself, who carried the dignity of a man determined to reclaim the truth stolen from him. When the proceedings began, Sophia rose and presented the case with unwavering precision, laying out each piece of evidence with the clarity of someone who understood the profound weight of what had been done to her client. She began with Evelyn Harper's unedited footage. Played on a large monitor before the court, the crisp images revealed every gesture, every word, every moment in which Jamal had complied with the officer's commands. The video showed his hands raised, his calm demeanor, and the violent force used against him without provocation. The courtroom remained silent as the footage played. Not a whisper, not a shifting seat, not even the soft rustling of papers. When the final frame froze on the screen, the truth struck the room with undeniable force. Sophia followed the footage with evidence of the facial recognition error that initiated the wrongful stop. She called an expert who explained the flaw in the algorithm that misidentified Jamal, a flaw disproportionately affecting Black individuals. The expert's testimony highlighted the systemic bias embedded in the technology and showed that the officers were informed of its unreliability before deployment. Next, Sophia introduced the internal documents provided by Lieutenant Maria Cortez, revealing years of buried complaints against Derek Harlan, excessive force, verbal abuse, falsified reports, and retaliatory threats. Each record displayed a pattern of misconduct that had been ignored or actively hidden by the department. Then she presented the recovered text messages between Harlan and Mike Stanton, projected onto the courtroom screen. The words "teach him a lesson" hung in the air with chilling clarity. Stanton, visibly tense, shifted in his seat while Harlan's expression tightened, unable to mask his discomfort. Sophia walked the court through the deleted footage recovered by federal forensics teams, naming every attempt to alter the sequence of events. She outlined the dispatch logs edited minutes after the arrest and showed email correspondence revealing collusion between the chief and the district attorney's office to frame the incident as a justified stop. By the time she concluded her presentation, the defense's carefully constructed narrative had collapsed. District Attorney Victor Lang attempted to salvage his argument, speaking with a strained authority that wavered beneath the weight of the evidence displayed before him. He claimed that the officers acted reasonably, that they made a split-second decision based on available information, and that the resistance described in the reports justified their actions. But Judge Vargas interrupted him with a firm tone that left no room for ambiguity. She read aloud portions of the footage where Jamal complied fully. She referenced the deleted files. She cited the officer's own text messages. Each point struck at the foundation of Lang's argument. Exposing its hollowness with sharp precision, Lang's confidence crumbled as he realized that the courtroom, the public, and the federal investigators no longer saw him as a figure of authority, but as a man attempting to shield misconduct with institutional power. After a brief recess, Judge Vargas returned to deliver her decision. The courtroom rose, then settled into a hush so complete that it seemed the air itself held its breath. She began by acknowledging the gravity of the case, the harm inflicted, and the responsibility the justice system bore to correct it. With measured words, she dismissed all charges against Jamal with prejudice, stating clearly that the charges should never have been filed. She expressed concern over the manipulation of evidence, the suppression of truth, and the abuse of authority by those entrusted with enforcing the law. Her voice carried the weight of both her office and her conscience as she offered a rare public apology to Jamal on behalf of the court, acknowledging the suffering he endured and the danger he faced because of the unlawful actions taken against him. When she finished, Judge Vargas took an additional step that sent ripples through the courtroom. She referred Derek Harlan and Mike Stanton to federal prosecutors for criminal investigation and recommended an independent ethics review of the district attorney's office. The officers' faces blanched as her words echoed across the courtroom. The reality of their actions, once hidden beneath the protective veneer of departmental loyalty, now stood exposed and condemned by federal authority. The chief's absence from the hearing only underscored the unraveling of the system that had protected them. As the judge adjourned the session, the courtroom erupted, not with chaos, but with an overwhelming surge of emotion. Reporters hurried to broadcast the ruling. Community members embraced one another, holding back tears of relief and vindication. Maria Cortez stood in the back, her posture straight, but her eyes bright with quiet pride. Knowing the truth had finally pierced through the barrier she had spent years pushing against. Sophia turned to Jamal with a soft, steady smile, her expression carrying a mixture of triumph and respect. She had fought tirelessly for him, and he had stood with unwavering dignity through every attempt to break him. Jamal walked out of the courthouse slowly, every step carrying the weight of the journey that had brought him to this moment. The bright Georgia sunlight greeted him with warmth as he descended the courthouse steps. Awaiting him were Aaliyah and Evelyn, standing side by side with open arms. Aaliyah rushed forward first, her face lit with relief and joy as she wrapped her arms around her father. He held her tightly, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, grateful beyond words that she had been spared further fear. Evelyn approached next, her expression emotional yet resolute. Jamal embraced her with deep gratitude, aware that her courage had preserved the truth that changed the course of the entire case. Around them, cameras flashed, capturing the moment for viewers across the nation. Reporters called his name, asking for statements. But Jamal focused on the people beside him, on the strength they had shown, on the truth they defended. He breathed deeply, feeling the sunlight warm his face, and allowed a quiet sense of peace to settle into his spirit. This victory did not erase the pain he endured. It did not undo the threats or the fear or the betrayal, but it marked the beginning of a restoration he had fought for with everything he had. In that moment, standing on the courthouse steps, reunited with the people who believed in him, Jamal understood that justice, long delayed but no longer denied, had begun to take shape, and the men who wronged him, once shielded by power, now faced a reckoning none of them could escape. 1 year later, the arc of accountability that began with a violent wrongful arrest reached its full measure, reshaping lives, institutions, and an entire community. Derek Harlan, once the officer who stood above others with a sense of untouchable authority, now entered a federal courtroom in shackles, his posture rigid with the realization that his career had ended the moment he slammed an innocent man against a patrol car. The evidence gathered by Agent Kira Sato, the testimony of Maria Cortez, and the unshakable clarity of Evelyn Harper's footage formed a case too strong for any defense to distort. The judge sentenced Harlan to 5 years in federal prison for civil rights violations and falsifying official documents, delivering a ruling with solemn emphasis on the responsibility law enforcement owes to the communities they serve. Harlan showed no defiance now. His once unchecked arrogance was gone, replaced by a dull resignation as he was escorted away to begin the sentence that marked the final chapter of his failed career. Mike Stanton, whose silence had shielded corruption, received 18 months of probation and permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification. His punishment reflected the weight of complicity. He stood in court unable to meet Jamal's eyes, knowing that his willingness to follow orders rather than uphold truth had cost him everything he once believed made him honorable. Chief Harlan Vance fell next, under the unrelenting scrutiny of federal investigators, oversight boards, and an enraged public. The layers of protection he had built around his cousin collapsed. He resigned in disgrace, facing civil suits filed by former complainants whose grievances had been ignored under his leadership. The pressure fractured what remained of his reputation, and as the lawsuits mounted, he declared bankruptcy to cover the legal costs he could no longer evade. His career, once bolstered by political favor and departmental loyalty, ended not with ceremony, but with silence. District Attorney Victor Lang faced his own reckoning. The ethics probe launched after the federal court hearing uncovered a pattern of misconduct, political maneuvering, and deliberate disregard for truth. His attempt to frame Jamal, his refusal to drop charges in the face of overwhelming evidence, and his coordination with the department to control the narrative formed a record of irreversible breach. After months of investigation, he was disbarred. He packed his office quietly on a summer morning, avoiding eye contact with colleagues who no longer saw him as a protector of justice, but as an architect of injustice. Karen Whitaker, whose initial call set the entire ordeal in motion, encountered consequences of a different kind. Jamal filed a civil suit for false reporting and emotional distress, supported by the video evidence and by testimony from neighbors who described her pattern of suspicion toward black residents. The court ruled against her, ordering significant damages, under mounting public pressure and facing the collapse of her social relationships. She sold her home and moved away. The quiet neighborhood that once shielded her prejudices no longer tolerated silence in the face of her actions. Her departure marked the end of an era in which her biases had gone unchallenged. Through it all, Jamal carried himself with steady resolve. The financial settlement reached between him and the city, $5 million awarded for the physical injuries, emotional trauma, and lasting damage inflicted by the false arrest, became a tool he used not to avenge, but to build. He established the Jamal Thompson Community Justice Fund, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing free legal assistance to residents facing discrimination, unlawful stops, or misuse of surveillance technology. He hired attorneys, outreach workers, and policy advisors, ensuring the fund would serve as a resource for the vulnerable and a watchdog against abusive practices. But the mission extended beyond legal defense. Jamal partnered with technology experts to develop workshops explaining the risks and failures of facial recognition systems, teaching communities how to protect themselves and advocate for responsible policy. He traveled to schools, churches, and civic centers, speaking with a quiet power that carried the weight of lived experience. His words resonated deeply with those who had suffered in silence, empowering them to recognize their rights and demand accountability. The story closed on a bright afternoon, 1 year after the verdict, as the community gathered for the fund's first public training session at the local center. The room filled early, every seat occupied by residents eager to learn or to show support for the man who had transformed his suffering into a movement for justice. Evelyn Harper, her posture upright and dignified, sat near the front with her phone in hand, ready to capture the moment. Sofia Ramirez stood beside her, her expression warm with pride, aware that her work in the courtroom had become part of a larger legacy. Alicia Rivera adjusted her camera equipment in the back, prepared to document the event that represented the culmination of months of courage and persistence. Reverend Elijah Grant opened the gathering with a brief reflection, reminding everyone that moments of injustice can break a person or build a movement, and that Jamal had chosen the path that strengthened them all. Aaliyah, now more confident after a year of healing and support, handed out printed programs to attendees. She looked up at her father with admiration, understanding that his fight had shaped more than his own future. It had shaped hers as well. Jamal stepped to the front of the room, standing beneath the simple banner bearing the fund's name. He began speaking with calm conviction, his voice steady, warm, and filled with purpose. He told the story not to relive the trauma, but to illuminate the path forward. He spoke of accountability, responsibility, courage, and the strength found in unity. He acknowledged every person who had stood with him: Evelyn, Sophia, Alicia, Reverend Grant, and especially Aaliyah, each a pillar in the structure of justice that rose from his experience. As the audience listened, the truth of his journey settled into the room like a steady heartbeat. His story was not just a recounting of past wrongs. It was a reminder of the power held by ordinary people when they choose to challenge injustice rather than accept it. The session continued with open discussion, shared stories, and a collective commitment to transforming the lessons of the past into protection for the future. And as the sun filtered through the windows, illuminating the faces of those gathered, one thing became clear: Jamal's story, born from a single act of prejudice and violence, had grown into a legacy of resilience and reform. The men who tried to silence him had lost their careers, but Jamal had gained something far greater: purpose, community, and the enduring strength of justice carried forward. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it moved you in any way, please consider subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing it with someone who cares about justice. Your support helps these stories reach others who need to hear them.